Uh, Good morning, gentlemen, the listeners, and the audience of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute's webinar series 2. A very warm welcome from Winnipeg, Manitoba. It's a beautiful day outside, and we all would love to go camping or hiking, but instead we are talking about, and we would be talking about very important things today. Just to introduce Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, it's a Winnipeg-based research think tank that was founded in 2017. Today, I just wanted to lay the background of our discussion, and I think it's important to talk about two aspects that I would like to share with you. I was going through some of the literatures and things that have been written in various media platforms, and two interesting pieces that I wanted to share with our audience today. One is the lessons from 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, and one of the writers, Alan Moses, his name is, he wrote in MD, World MD Journal, medical journal, on April 20th that there are four takeaways from 1918 pandemic. So first one is, he's writing, and I'm quoting, they didn't even know that it was a virus. There had been decades of research on microbes, so they understood that it was transferred person to person through respiratory drops by coughing and sneezing. But viruses were not discovered until 1930s because they didn't have powerful enough microscope. The second takeaway is, despite differences, parallel between 1918 and 2020 are still striking. In both cases, there was no vaccine and no treatment for the disease, along with an overriding fear that a besieged healthcare system might crack. The third one is, both pandemics and most effective immediate response was and is social distancing. And at that time, it was called crowding control. But whatever you call it, limiting contact worked in 1918, and it works today. And final takeaway was, in 1918, you had a tension between biological reality and socioeconomic reality. And biology is not changeable, but behavior is. So yes, social distancing was absolutely a thing in 1918, and it was practiced and it worked. And quite interestingly, I found another article written by one of my favorite professors from Hebrew University, Noah Hariri, and he wrote in Guardian on the same day, actually. He was talking about, and his basic question was, would the current pandemic change human attitude to death? And he was saying, and I'm quoting here, he was saying that probably not, just the opposite. COVID-19 will probably cause us to only double our efforts to protect human lives. For the dominant cultural reaction to COVID-19 isn't resignation, it is a mixture of outrage and hope. Attitudes today are very polar opposite than that of earlier medieval Europe. Whenever some disaster kills many people in today's world, we tend to view it as a preventable human failure rather than as divine punishment or an inevitable natural calamity. When the vaccine is indeed ready and pandemic is over, what will be humanity's main takeaway? In all likelihood, it will be that we need to invest even more efforts in protecting human lives. We need to have more hospitals, more doctors, more nurses. We need to stockpile more respiratory machines, more protective gears, more testing kits. We need to invest more money in researching unknown pathogens and developing novel treatments. We should not be caught off guard again. He goes on saying that the present crisis might indeed make many individuals more aware of the impermanent nature of human life and human achievements. Nevertheless, our modern civilization as a whole will most probably go in the opposite direction. Reminded of its fragility, it will react by building stronger defenses. When the present crisis is over, he says that he doesn't expect that we would see a significant increase in the budgets of philosophy departments, but he bets he will see a massive increase in the budgets of medical schools and healthcare systems. I hope this lays the background of our today's webinar. Two eminent scholars from Manitoba, Winnipeg joined us today to discuss on two very important topics. I shall moderate the webinar today, and we have requested our panelists to speak on the selected topics of their own choice for about 15 minutes. And once they complete their talks, presentations, we would open the forum for Q&A. This session is being streamed live in Facebook and YouTube channel of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute website. However, if you want to interact and send questions to the panelists directly, please do let us know and we'll send you a web link to connect. You can also send your questions via Facebook page and webinar as well. CRRIC volunteer is monitoring the Facebook web page and will facilitate questions and answer session. Without further ado, let's welcome and introduce our first panelist today. He is Dr. Christopher Adams, and he holds a PhD from Carleton University and served in senior positions in the public opinion research industry. He is the author of numerous journal articles and Politics in Manitoba, which was published by University of Manitoba Press. He is a regular media commentator on polling and elections. Dr. Adams currently serves as the rector of St. Paul's College and is an adjunct professor in political studies at the University of Manitoba. Welcome, Dr. Christopher Adams.
Thank you, Kauser. I want to thank you for that introduction. I'm glad to join you and Halal from CRRIC as part of this presentation. The work that CRRIC does is important work, particularly regarding the Rohingya crisis. So I've developed quite a bit of admiration for your institute. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'm glad to join my friend and fellow political scientist, Dr. Malcolm Bird from the University of Winnipeg, who is also an associate member of St. Paul's College. Malcolm and I interact with each other quite often. We're part of the same Catholic parish, often on Sundays and so on and so forth. So I'm glad to join with Malcolm here.
Thank you.
So my remarks are really divided into three topical areas. I'm going to be talking about the political economy or certain aspects of political economy issues, mostly as it relates to government spending and issues in that regard. But the first area that I'm going to cover are comments regarding the American scene. And then I'm going to move into comments about the Canadian scene, particularly the federal government. And finally, I'll just round off with some comments about local Manitoba politics as it interacts with this issue of the pandemic. But I want to caution individuals that I'm not a scientist, only a mere social scientist. I compliment Dr. Delantha Fernando, my colleague and Dean of St. Paul's College, who spoke at CRRIC's panel, at this institute's panel yesterday morning. I followed his answers at the Q&A session, and I learned quite a bit. It was regarding some technical aspects of the natural scientist instead of the more social science aspect of things. But so this is part two, I guess, in a way of this series. But in contrast to health workers and scientists, I have nothing to say on such things as flattening the curve, vaccinations, and other such matters. I'm going to be more focused on political economy issues. So on the first area, the American scene, a week ago, the New York Times reported on a number of indicators regarding the American economy. An additional 3 million Americans that week had been entering the rolls of the unemployed in the USA. In the past 2 months of the lockdown, 36 million Americans became unemployed. In April retail sales were down 16%, but apparel and clothing stores had lost close to 90%. That's 90% of their sales in those 2 months. Industrial production in the US is down by the most level since before, not during, but before the Great Depression of the 1930s. So if we're looking at industrial production, the American economy has been pretty well wiped out for the current period. So in the meantime, Jerome Powell, who's the chair of the American Federal Reserve, reported that all the job gains made over the past decade were erased, with a particular effect on Black Americans and those in low income situations. And we know that's been the case in Canada as well. A recent study out of Toronto, examining census subdivisions in Toronto, showed that the low income parts of Toronto were twice as likely to be affected by COVID compared to the higher income parts of Toronto. So this is a phenomena across North America of socioeconomic class not being equally affected by the pandemic. So Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, also stated his particular concern that, quote, long and deep recessions can have a lasting damage to the productive capacity of the economy, unquote. So his issue is not so much that we're in a periodic downturn and it'll all spring back, but his concern is a long and deep recession having irreparable problems in going forward. So one outcome is that those who are unemployed may lose their connections to the economy and become permanently unemployed. Small owners, having slowly built up their businesses over a length of time, are unable to bounce back in a long recession and are permanently shuttered. And that will have particular effects in certain neighborhoods, far from the big metropolis areas. In the smaller areas, we could see small town America being made a ghost town. So the U.S. Congress, in a bipartisan effort, which is unusual these days to see the Congress acting in a bipartisan rather than partisan manner, in a bipartisan effort to address the crisis, approved $2.9 trillion. That's trillion, not billion. $2.9 trillion for emergency spending. However, according to Jerome Powell, this is only the start, and he compares it to building a bridge, but only taking it halfway across the river. There is some indication that the Congress, that is the Senate and the House of Representatives, is returning back to its partisan ways. One example is Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, who said, quote, we need to be smart and we need to be safe and we have to find the middle ground. But at the same time, a wait and see attitude in terms of doing more spending as the pandemic damage on the American economy continues. So for the American scene, Canadians have to be wary. My belief is that over the next year and to 2 years, we will see crises after crises on the social, economic, and political scene. Just about 4 weeks ago, the head science reporter for the New York Times had commented that we're going to be into a prolonged, what he called hammer and dance. And what he means by hammer and dance is coming out of the households, being part of business, but then having another wave hit and going back into a lockdown again. So he sees this happening for the next year, maybe 2 years. So as the old saying is that when the United States has a cough or a cold, Canada gets the flu. So what happens south of the border, we have to be concerned about. So on to my second areas, the Canadian scene. In Canada, according to mid-May figures, just to show how things are changing in terms of how we communicate with each other, Dean Provost, the president of the business division of Rogers Communications, said in Canada with Rogers Communications, home internet usage is up by over 50%. Voice wireless call usage is up by 40%. The 1-800 toll-free calls are up by 300%. TELUS Corporation, in the meantime, tells us their wireless network has been consistently reaching 4 times its busiest periods of pre-pandemic times. So the Canadian ways by which we communicate with each other, just the fact that we're doing this webinar today, is an indication that the way we interact with each other has really undergone a big change. And the question is, when we go back, if we go back to normal periods, how will we communicate with each other? And I think in many ways, Canadians will have more of a mixture of remote interaction rather than going from non-remote in many ways to remote and then back to like 100% in class, 100% in your office buildings, things like that. I think of the white collar portion of our population, they'll be doing more of a mixture of how we interact with each other in a different way than we were before. So in terms of the federal government response, I see across Canada that the response by our governments, provincial and federal, it's been more coherent than in the United States. We see different regional responses right now in the United States, whereas I think we've been fairly consistent in how our governments have responded. We see a strong willingness, especially by the federal government, to go into deficit spending to address, much like Congress did it in its first phase of spending. So the Canadian deficit was reported March 27th. So just for those who don't really follow government spending terminology, the debt is the overall, what the government owes at a certain point. The deficit is for that year, the shortfall of revenues behind expenditures. So If in a year a budget shows that you're spending a little bit more than you're bringing in by revenues, that's the deficit. So ongoing deficits means that you're adding to the overall debt if you keep on running deficits. So the Canadian deficit for the current budget year was expected to be reported at $112 billion. That is 112, March 27th. It went up to $184 billion, April 9th. Then 252, more than double in 1 month, was the deficit predicted for this budget year. And we also have to consider how this will add to the Canadian debt, which last year was projected by Finance Minister Bill Marneau to be over $1 trillion. That's T for trillion, $1 trillion. So there is something, I don't get me wrong, I'm supportive of government spending right now, but there are repercussions that we'll have to be addressing afterwards. Observers such as Andrew Coyne of the Globe and Mail, who's actually a graduate of Kelvin High School of Winnipeg, just so you know, of the Globe and Mail, and those who write for Report on Business have speculated on a few scenarios. One scenario is a happy scenario, the other one is unhappy. And let's start with the happy scenario. Markets bounce back quickly, like a V pattern. Markets bounce back quickly and interest remains under 1%. So interest rates remain low. So compared to the mid-90s, when Finance Minister Paul Martin introduced strong austerity measures under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, at that time the gross domestic product debt to gross domestic product ratio was 66%. Right now, the debt to gross domestic product is at 30%. So we are in a better situation going into this pandemic crisis financially than we were in the mid-90s. Nevertheless, we're spending a lot of money, and there will be a time that we have to address that. So anyway, that's the happy scenario. Markets bounce back, interest rates stay low, and it would kind of come out of this difficulty. The unhappy scenario is, rather than the V shape of the markets going down and up, a possible second wave puts us back into the lockdown, the hammer and dance scenario I was talking about, the New York Times was talking about, and interest rates increase. So an unhappy situation would be our businesses don't bounce back, our markets remain down 30% or go even further down, and we don't have a quick bounce back, and interest rates go up. So the unhappy scenario is, do we become a basket case such as Greece? So that is a concern, and it's a deep unhappy worry that people have. So in the meantime, in Canada, we might talk about federal government spending and debt. We have to remember that in a federal government or federal state, we have two layers of government. And so the provinces themselves are taking on debt. So there are multiple layers of debt going on here. And we have to worry, will we get downgraded by our lenders? So in the meantime, in terms of the provinces, in particular Manitoba, Premier Pallister claimed we were heading to a $5 billion deficit. And that was his forecast. Royal Bank of Canada pegged this, and others have pegged it more at $1.5 billion. So only about 25% of what Brian Pallister was predicting. Nevertheless, it's still a lot of money, whether it's $1.5 billion or $5 billion for a province of the size of just over 1 million people. So in many ways, turning thirdly to the provincial scene, we see that we see that Premier Doug Ford has embraced the situation. Some people love the big lug. They didn't like him before. Some people like Premier Ford. I would say that the response by Brian Pallister has not been as coherent in this province. I think he was fortunate that he chose to call an election a year early for other reasons than I mean, he wasn't a mystic who saw the pandemic coming. But can you imagine if he were facing an election this year compared to last year? At the same time, I should say that I looked at some probe research data of political support for the parties. They weren't published, but they were from the late April poll that was done regarding the pandemic crisis in Manitoba, but they also had the provincial party question. And the PCs at late April had not looked overly damaged by what the voters were thinking about that. But there have been things since then that in terms of the call for 10, 20, and 30% salary cuts by the premier that many people thought were draconian. We in the universities, Malcolm at the University of Winnipeg and myself at the University of Manitoba, we have been sent some shocking requests for cuts, but they aren't as severe as was initially thought, 10 to 20 to 30%. The cuts are more in the 4, 5, 6% range. And it's like Brian Eno, the rock musician, who says you go to an extreme position, you retreat to a usable place. In some ways, I think that's what the premier has done, but it's made people very nervous, I would say, and have not been happy about the tone of the public rhetoric. So I'm just going to conclude with just one thing. We're talking about how do people feel about coming out of this into the next phase. We've just had the announcement of phase 1, where we can get our hair cut. Like my lustrous locks are still there, but eventually I have to get a haircut. We're going to phase 2, where even some schools might be opening on one-to-one instruction for K to 12. So as we come out into this new liberating period of time, we have to think about, what do Manitobans think? And the poll done in late April by Probe Research on the pandemic showed that 57% of Manitobans, more than half of Manitobans at the time in late April, said that life will be very different than it was before. So many people don't feel that we're going to be suddenly liberated from our situation and go back to normal. The majority of Manitobans don't feel that they'll be coming back. We had as a president of a Catholic college here, St. Paul's College, I'm in on weekly calls with Universities Canada, and Bruce Anderson of Abacus Research had a poll of 1,000 university students and another sample of parents of those university students. And a good proportion of them said they would feel uncomfortable going back to campus, even if they're told by the authorities it's safe to go back. So there's a sense that there's still a fragility in the population about going back. And the other thing is, Probe Research also in the same poll said 72%. So almost 3/4 of Manitobans agree that this pandemic will have a permanent damage to our economy. So even if we're told that we can get outdoors, we're still in a serious situation. So those are my comments on the American side, the Canadian side, and a little bit on domestic. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chris, for a very insightful discussion. And we have a lot of statistics going around in our head by now. So our next panelist and speaker is Dr. Malcolm Bird, and he's an associate professor of political science at the University of Winnipeg. And he's fascinated by Canadian Crown corporations and is currently working on a book on the evolution of Liquor Control Board of Ontario. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Malcolm Bird.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be with everyone here, sharing some thoughts on the current pandemic. Just a little bit about my title: Exogenous Shock, the State, the Deficit, and Young People. Some initial thoughts on the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, I'm an academic, and we like to use, big words. It makes us feel smart. and so, I've been thinking about the pandemic as an exogenous shock. That is, and I think it's an effective way to sort of assess and analyze both the pandemic itself and the response to it, particularly the lockdown. And I don't mean to diminish the significance of this. This has imposed great hardships on 5 million Canadian families that where someone doesn't have a job, the 6,000 deaths. This very imposing great burdens on frontline workers. So I do think I kind of want to assess it in a sort of more objective, social science manner. And an exogenous shock is an event or a series of events that occur outside of an institution. They're not endogenous, that's inside, but they're outside. And war, weather events, those are sort of the usual characters of exogenous events. And what they do is they test the mettle or the strength or the robustness of institutions. And when I talk about institutions, what I really mean is just coordinating devices. And institutions, of course, range from families and marriages to state institutions, healthcare systems, education, universities, corporations, public health, companies. Companies are coordinating institutions, small, medium, large. And then, of course, we have third sector institutions, NGOs, churches, charities, et cetera, et cetera. So this exogenous event has put pressure on all coordinating devices, all institutions. And of course, when you put pressure on institutions, how do they respond? How do they cope? Do they cope? And I guess my thesis, which I'm now realizing that my talk is probably kind of positive, is that in Canada, we have very robust institutions, particularly public institutions. Our state institutions have stepped up and have shown their robustness, have shown their strength under tremendous pressure. Now, this is partly because we already have initially very strong institutions, and that those strong institutions are why we have a lot of wealth. We're a really wealthy place. And so we've gotten through at least this first round of COVID-19 quite well. We didn't end up like Italy or New York or Spain or many other places. We've really been blessed. I think some of that's fortuitous, just luck. But a lot of it has to do with just the strength of our public institutions and all of our institutions more generally. I mean, think of how quickly we were able to, here in Manitoba, we opened up 30 brand new ICU units. We got our hands on PPE equipment. We figured out how to get ventilators. We figured out protocols. Public health agencies stepped up. Educational institutions stepped up. My kids are being educated. Universities are still working. The power did not go off. Remember, if the electricity goes off in Manitoba, we all become refugees in 3 days. Okay? Power never went off. The water's still working. Police, fire, the liquor boards are still open. The pharmacies still work. The grocery stores still work. The fuel is still here. So we were able to see the core institutions continue to operate quite well. Our supply chains are very robust. Okay, who ever really thought about supply chains until now? And turns out, wow, they really do work. And when there were failures in markets, in families, the state was able to step in. And this is best illustrated by the CERB, business assistance, EI, welfare, et cetera. Massive amounts of dough were poured in. So again, public institutions, the state was able to manage failures in other institutions and to manage them very well. So that's sort of my first point about the state. The next point about the state is, now I don't want to say globalization is over, okay? But this pandemic has certainly focused our attention on the nation state and its absolute seminal importance, okay? All of a sudden, we all became very concerned about, can we make our own PPE equipment? Can we make our own ventilators? Okay, and if we do, and if we can make them, they're going to go to our citizens first. Now, Mr. Trump got in great trouble. It was great uproar when he prevented a batch of PPE equipment at the border from coming up here into Canada. Now, but what did you expect? I mean, did you expect Mr. Trump to not favor his own citizens over those of another nation? No. The role of the nation state is to look after its citizens first. A few weeks later, when we discovered that 85% of the Canadian meat packing industry is from 3 plants in Alberta, another astonishing fact, Justin Trudeau got up and said, look, if there is any problems, there will be export controls imposed on meat. We're going to feed ourselves first. And rightly so. Of course, the state's going to look after himself. Now, of course, there was no accompanying uproar over that. But the point is, we are seeing the value of the nation state and the importance of autocratic autarky or self-sufficiency within the nation state. Can we look after ourselves? I mean, we've been going through 30 years of deindustrialization here in Canada. Tens of millions of Canadians have lost their jobs, good manufacturing jobs. Well, thank God we still have some capacity to make ventilators, to make PPE equipment. This is going to fundamentally cause us to really think about globalization and the importance of like I said, the nation state and the different sectors within it. The borders are shut. Not a peep of outrage. Now they're open to trade with the United States, but you can't fly around. Borders, and rightly so. I think we should close the provincial borders as well. Anyways, okay. So the centrality of the nation state. Those Brexiteers, my third point, look at the EU. Those Brexiteers, figured it out long before COVID-19. I don't want to say the EU is dead, but I think the EU is kind of dead. Look at the response that the European countries had. They shut their borders. They looked after their own citizens. Italy, if we want to talk about an indebted nation, the sixth largest nation, it's in real trouble. And we'll see what the reaction of the European Union is to it. But clearly, the pan-national institutions are not as significant as the nation state. So I don't know how we ever thought that the nation state was going to go away. But anyways, it's now back with much vengeance. My next point, the deficit, and Chris talked about this very, very well. I support the decision. Governments, you borrow money in difficult times, you spread it around, and we're able to do this. So Chris, $250 billion at the federal level, I believe $100 billion for all the provinces. My numbers for Manitoba were 3.5 billion, but 1.5 doesn't really matter. These are huge, huge numbers, and this does not include the quantitative easing and the purchasing of corporate and provincial debt by the central bank. That needs to be added in there as well. Borrowing by governments is dangerous, and we need to be aware of this, because it allows for immediate political payoff without the associated political cost of raising taxes. And the burden of the deficit is placed onto other people's shoulders, people who aren't even born yet, young people. And that's really problematic. If this is a one-off, I think we'll be okay. But I suspect it's going to come back. And are we going to borrow another $350 billion in November when this thing comes back? There's a real lack of concern about the significance of this, and there's a real lack of debate and discussion, and that in and of itself, I think is worrying. The young, okay, I agree. An exogenous shock pushes on institutions, and the prior health and strength of those institutions will determine, how well they come out. And so an exogenous shock is going to exacerbate inequalities within society. And I see this in my own family. My wife and I both have stable public sector jobs. We have lots of devices. My kids go to a great school. We're actually weathering this really well. In fact, we're kind of enjoying our time together. But I think of the 5 million Canadians who aren't enjoying this time, don't have paychecks, and don't have anything to do all day. So, I have this great privilege, and like I said, I recognize that, and so we talk about inequalities along class and gender and ethnic lines, but there's very little discussion about inequalities among demographic lines. Okay, particularly regarding public spending. About 4 times as much public dough goes to people over 65 than under 30. Don't quote me on that. But far more dough goes to older people than younger people. Okay, this is in and of itself very disconcerting. When I looked at the unemployment numbers that came out a few weeks ago, almost all the job losses were by people under 40. It was amazing. Now, part of this is because of the sectors that they're in the service sector, etc. But it also is formally institutionalized. When Manitoba Hydro is going to lay off 700 people, those are all the young people that are going to lose their jobs. And that's really, really worrying. And as Chris mentioned, we know that when people lose their jobs, when they face unemployment early on in their career, has a lifelong effect. This is another example of the challenges that young people in Canada face, largely because of the privilege enjoyed by the baby boomers. Okay, so this is a gross inequality. To top it all off, both Justin Trudeau and Brian Pallister went out and are going to give old people free money. This is astonishing. Old people, people over 65, for the most part, tend to be quite wealthy, and they have access to a guaranteed income in Canada. And yet they get free money from both the federal and the provincial government. And this is clearly a political move to garner votes from them. And that's really worrying, particularly, like I said, when you look at the inequalities in terms of the job losses. And then you think about the burden that these deficits and the debt will place on young people. And that's really, really worrying. So there are my thoughts. I hope that was coherent. And I look forward to any questions and comments people may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bud, for, I would say, very passionate discussion, and we enjoyed, all of us. Now, I just wanted to invite Dr. Dr. Mohideen from Bangladesh. He teaches at North-South University as a professor of anthropology. So I would request Dr. Mohideen to kindly limit his discussion around 5 to 6 minutes, because we have another panelist, speaker waiting in the backstage. Thank you, and here we have Dr. Mohideen.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris and Malcolm, and Dr. Kausar as well. Oh, I was listening. It's a wonderful discussion, indeed. And a very good insight for me, because I was thinking about lessons learned from this COVID-19, how the global communities will be utilizing the lessons learned. And Canada is the most important country for all of the countries, because we have seen what Malcolm just explained, that okay, we had shown our capacity to utilize the robust public institutions. Their roles were played so efficiently and so skillfully that the global communities, they started to acknowledge them with due respect, because actually Canada did very well compared to other countries. And people started to think about nation state as well. This is another observation that really matched with Malcolm's observation and my observation, because European Union is now being questioned whether it did really perform well. If not, whatever evidences we have until now, it did not really do that well compared to Canada. So now people have started to ask the question whether people should think more about having the strength of nation states, independent strength, their own strength, so that they can supply all the necessary utilities and everything citizens need just in time. And the countries are capable, whether countries are being capable, especially self-reliant and independent, so that they can cope with the shock just as efficiently as Canada did. So this is another very important question. And here I am trying to bring in the discussion of globalization. Now we are globalized country. All countries are globalized in a sense, and we are living in a global village like Bangladesh. Its revenue, foreign earning, its GDP, everything is completely dependent. I think about 80% is dependent on foreign revenue earning. One is the government sector. It alone brings about 51 to 53% of national GDP. And then the pharmaceutical sector, another big sector. And the third one is the foreign workers. They send remittances to these countries. Okay, there will be big shock for these countries. And these countries' public institutions are not as strong as Canada. And they will not be as strong in the next 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 decades. It will be completely difficult for these countries to become that strong or to gain that type of strength in the next 2 or 3 decades. So it is going to be a big challenge for them as well. Yesterday, when we were discussing, we brought the issue of having a global international strategy, especially led by the World Health Organization that we should have something integrated, because now all countries are integrated. JCPenney has closed their outlets, and they declared, right, the organization declared bankrupt. And probably other buyers that are heavily dependent on supply of the Bangladeshi government, Bangladesh manufactured garments, they might close down at some point, and Bangladesh will face the ultimate shock. All these shocks are there. We need to have, this is my understanding, that okay, we need to utilize. So from this point on, World Health Organization should be made in, efficient and capable to bring all the countries in a round table so that we can have an integrated international disaster management policy, especially in the health sector. If something strikes like COVID-19 in the future, probably we'll be able to cope with these problems soon, but there would be a kind of technical solution. We are looking about how it is, the perception that we need to focus more on human psychology, human philosophy, and social, strategies, not only the medical strategies, that most of the funding will be uh, deployed for probably medical sort of solutions, but we need social sort of solutions as well. So we need some kind of international intervention. This is one important thing. Other important aspect, just I am concluding my analysis, this is about a digital divide. We are not looking at that. Like, okay, in Canada, we are managing it quite well, universities and schools. In our country, we are already having some problems. Bangladesh is heavily digitized at this moment, and we have the capacity to use internet, but still there are millions of people who don't have access to internet, especially the senior people. Now the personal relationship always matters, and touch matters, our physical communication matters. We cannot continue social distancing this way for more than 5, 6, 7 months. It's a people's natural instinct to go back to their families and hug their dearer and nearer ones. So that we need to think about, because this technical solution is not a solution at all. Probably it's a kind of band-aid solution. We need something in terms of social solutions. So this is my final take on this discussion, that okay, our senior people, as Malcolm mentioned, that okay, probably we are making a kind of discrimination here as well. Most of the resources are being utilized against the baby boomers. I don't know whether this is because they have already invested a lot in the past through different policies, like through different insurance schemes or other things, and now they are enjoying the benefits, or it is a drain on the national revenue system, national exchequer. That's another important question. Probably we need to think about that. But in our countries, especially in the developing countries, when we need to ask for help from the developed countries like Canada, in the areas of global sort of assistance, aid programs, and scholarship programs, and all other programs, we still need to take care of our elderly people, because it has very strong social significance and anthropological significance. We learn a lot, and they are just the most important part of our society. We cannot just think them differently, that okay, probably we are wasting our money against them more than the young people. When young people are losing job, these people are getting benefited from all the sources, like from government sources and also social sources. So yeah, this is digital divide. We need to bridge that digital divide and social divide as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohideen. We have Dr. Dilantha with us, and he was listening the discussion. So welcome, Dr. Dilantha. Your floor. Just limit the discussion within 5 to 7 minutes, please. Thank you. Your mic is mute. Here you go.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kausar, for inviting me. It's glad to be with my colleague and boss, Dr. Christopher Adams, and also my friends, Dr. Kausar and Helal, and also my colleague in the Assembly of St. Paul's College, Dr. Malcolm Bird. Well, thank you again for that very inspiring discussions that all three of you gave. Um, I don't have much to add from what I had said yesterday, but I just wanted to make one comment that I missed yesterday. That is recognizing what CRRIC does and what Dr. Kauser and Dr. Helal are doing. And we are extremely proud at St. Paul's College to house you, CRRIC, for the work that you are doing, especially on refugees around the world and especially with the Rohingya crisis. The amount of knowledge that I gained from you, and then by reading more about the Rohingya crisis, has really enlightened me of the uh, situations that are there that are less spoken about in the world. There are certain countries that get prominence when there's a refugee crisis, and that's quite all right. That's the right thing to do. But also there are countries that are neglected for various political reasons, and that is only seen when people like you do that type of work to bring that to the authorities, to the notice of the Canadian authorities, to help these really uh, difficult situations in both Bangladesh and Myanmar. So that these are wonderful things that you are doing, and I just wanted to mention that. And I think what Chris and Malcolm mentioned, I 100% agree. And I just wanted to make one little comment on what Malcolm said also. I think putting your country first should not be taken as something that is uh, the wrong thing by another country. And Canada should not get overly reacting against what Donald Trump did. I'm not trying to say that I'm a supporter of Donald Trump here, but he is doing what he has to do for his country, and that goes a long way. And that's the same view that I have of Canada. We have to first do for what we are supposed to do for our citizens, safeguard our citizens in their health, wealth, and also make sure then do the things that we can do for others, which is also important. But first comes your citizens, and that was very well mentioned by Malcolm in his short presentation. So and coming to PPE, I think there's a lot of misunderstood things about this. The type of PPE that is worn by health authorities is not a requirement for us. So we don't have to get panicked that we don't have the same N95. We can use very different PPEs to protect ourselves and protect other people. And that is a message that still the government has not clearly laid out to people. Earlier, there was always the mention that PPEs have to be kept for the healthcare professionals and that we should not be wearing health masks and everything. I didn't agree with that statement from the very beginning, because even a handkerchief can protect you and protect others when you go to a grocery store or to a park or a school. So I think the one of the things that I didn't get a chance to talk about also is to commend the Manitoba government and the people of Manitoba for what they did and how they stood through this. It is that made our numbers so low compared to other cities and provinces. So I think a big thank you goes to the Manitoba government, whether we like the politics of the government or not. I think things that were done, the things that got, and also privately, people did things right. Private schools closed very quickly. Government schools had a directive, they closed schools, and those prevented that mass spread that can happen. And that comes back to my epidemiological knowledge. Spread has to happen with vectors, and the vector is a human beings are the vectors in this particular disease, unfortunately. So if we take this disease to another place, and we are going to infect and make it immensely difficult for certain people, especially the immune compromised people and the people who are older. So I'm getting to that age, so I know how that is to be protected. And especially with a young family, you worry a lot about, if I get this disease and I succumb, what is going to happen? So I think everything that was done by the University of Manitoba, University of Winnipeg, and many other institutes, I really commend, because that was the game changer for Manitoba, and we did it right, and we should applaud ourselves for what we did. So, so I'll stop there and take questions whenever it comes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dilantha. So that formally ends our discussion today. So now we are moving into question and answer session. And as a host, I take the privilege of putting forward only 2 questions, because there are a bunch of questions we have received from our listeners and viewers already. So I'll flash those on the screen for you. But quick question to Dr. Chris. So we have heard about your comments that government expenditure, borrowing money, and the way federal and provincial government started investing money in different sectors. So in all practicality, what do you think, Dr. Chris, that both these levels of government should adopt in terms of less borrowing, or is there any alternate way of managing the expenditure during the pandemic?
Well, thanks for that question. And Malcolm talked to this somewhat as well, but I would say that we have to pay it back. That it's easy to spend money, it's another thing to pay it back. And what I would say is there's got to be a plan developed for aggressively paying that back once we're coming out of the deep recession. What Alvin Hamilton, when he was Minister of Finance, when Diefenbaker was Prime Minister, this was before my time, but anyway, Alvin Hamilton was very shocked when Diefenbaker said that you don't win elections by cutting deficits. And so it will be very easy for us to continue building up debt. So we have to make a plan for paying back the debt that we accumulate. That doesn't mean cutting social programs and things like that, but there's got to be a plan in place. So we can't, as Charles Lindblom would say, we can't stumble through history like a drunkard, putting one incremental foot after another.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting response. Dr. Malcolm Bird, my question to you today, you have brought out a very interesting insight about nation states coming into full vengeance, if I may quote you. So my understanding is that, well, this is what pandemic has kind of forced upon us to rethink about our national capacity to face such crisis. But do you also see that with this, just capacity point of view, we also have started seeing radical groups of people walking on the street, demonstrating in the legislative buildings, those who claim themselves as anti-lockdown groups. And we have seen in Michigan, at least, armed people entering into the Legislative Assembly, and when eventually they stopped it. So what do you think this whole vibe of nationalism is actually bringing and possibly directing us towards a new horizon in the future?
Well, thank you for that. Just to speak about the anti-lockdown people, well, in Canada, it's been quite muted. In the United States, it has not. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that, protesting is very reasonable. And I think that now I happen to be quite charitable to the role of the state. And I believe that this pandemic is yet another example of the continued expansion of the state within our own lives, intervening ever more into the lives of families and children and companies and all of this sort of thing. And for Americans who are deeply concerned about the power of the state, this is very disconcerting. They really think about liberty. They really value it. There is a part of me, I mean, there is a part of me that is a liberal. I'm not always just pro-state. And I think that we do need to think about, and if you are a liberal and you are concerned about freedoms, that you think about the power of the state and the increased significance of it during a pandemic like that, like this. I mean, it illustrates how hegemonic the state is. So it doesn't surprise me that people in the United States are getting mad. They value the freedom, and having a robust debate about that is very reasonable. And remember that these a lot of working people. I mean, I have a nice public sector guaranteed job. If I'd lost my job, I might have a very different view of the value of the state and of the lockdown. If I could just quickly touch on what Chris said, your question to Chris, we're going to have to think about, raising taxes. We're going to have to think about the privilege that public sector employees enjoy. Almost all of the job losses have been in the private sector. And I think that's going to force us in the public sector to, we might have to, reduce civil servant wages or professor wages. I mean, there really is a big difference here. And no, I'm not saying this is, we need to undermine, the welfare state, but we're going to have to fundamentally evaluate, the entire public sector, including the secured privileged jobs that people hold within it. So we're going to have to, so anyways, that's sort of touching Chris's idea, but no, I mean, I think protest. I think people have legitimate grievances with the lockdown, and particularly the effects that it's having on different groups. Anyways, I hope that answers your question.
No, thank you. So we'll take questions from the audience now. The first one I'm flashing on the screen comes from Chris Hunt, and here you see it's posed to both of the panelists. Here you go.
So maybe I'll be the first to respond to this. I would say, right now we're, federally speaking, the Conservative Party of Canada is in a pretty weak situation. They've got a leadership debate going on between, it's been moved to an August mail-in ballot. The Andrew Scheer, I think, as much as I originally liked him as the leader, I think he's bungled the situation for the party. My prediction is Aaron O'Toole will be winning the leadership for the Conservative Party of Canada. So my thinking is it's hard to tell whether it's the pandemic or other elements that are causing problems for the Conservative Party of Canada. But at the same time, there's some people who are saying, doing a political poll right now nationally, the numbers are really meaningless. We know that Trudeau is way ahead, but things could turn around very, very quickly. So people were predicting back before Justin Trudeau was elected in his first term, people saw him as unwinnable against Harper. So I think things can turn around very, very quickly with the volatile nature of our voters in Canada. So right now, things do not look good for the Conservative Party, but you might remember they didn't look good for the Republican Party during Obama, and things turned around then. So I would say things look bleak right now, but I think 12 months from now, things might look very different for the Conservative Party of Canada. I would say in Manitoba, I saw some inside numbers Scott Mackay over at Probe Research shared with me from a poll they did at late April. The provincial government doesn't look like it's in trouble. I was surprised that the numbers are still holding for the Progressive Conservatives in Manitoba. But I would say that the premiers across Canada have actually done fairly well during this period. I think Quebec's had some problem, but I would say the Conservative Party provincially in Manitoba and federally are in different situations, but I would say that they're in a strong situation for their next election.
Well, I don't quite agree with Chris here. And there's a piece written by a friend of mine in the National Post who really encouraged people to look at the success of the Conservative parties at the provincial level and the dynamicism that we're seeing. 6 of our provinces are being run by Conservative governments, and they're being very well run. And that's where a lot of the skill and talent within the Conservative Party is focused right now. I think it's very important to recognize just how important the provinces are. The federal government actually doesn't do that much that's important in Canada, except for collect taxes and spread money around. All of the real responses, the health, the education, the infrastructure, public health, all of that, that's all done at the provincial level. And we have seen very robust responses by Canada's Conservative premiers. And I think the Conservative Party at the federal level actually is in better shape. Remember that Mr. Scheer got more votes than Mr. Trudeau did. And so I think, they might not have been distributed the same way, but he still got more votes. And so I think if anything, this is illustrating the dynamicism of the Conservative stripe within Canada and an efforts going on within the Conservative Party to develop more robust, more positive social policies. And the Conservatives really have an image problem that people think they're too focused on financial issues and that they are not really offering viable alternatives within the social policy realm. And I think they actually do have very good ideas to offer in this regard. So I think this has actually been quite good, particularly because of the supremacy and the supreme importance of provincial governments in Canada.
Okay, but you misunderstood what I was saying, Malcolm, with all due respect, is I wasn't saying that the Conservatives across Canada are in trouble. I was just saying the leadership right now at the federal Conservative Party is in quite a bit of difficulty. But my point is that I think that's a temporary situation that could be turned around by the Conservatives of Canada under a new leader. Going into they're in a minority government as opposition, and that could turn around an election a year from now. As we know, Justin Trudeau does have some difficulties sometimes on issues, and right now he's riding pretty high, but that can evaporate quickly. But I agree with you regarding the provincial governments across Canada. The Conservatives look fairly strong.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we'll take the next question, and just for the panelists' information, there are a lot of students listening and to our discussion today. So you will find questions coming from them as well. So here is one question, as you see in the screen.
That's a very good question. Yes, as much as we want to think of ourselves as being, as I was talking about self-sufficiency, Chris touched on this. But I guess it leads to the point that Canada is not globalizing. It is deeply, 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 and problematically integrated into the American economy. I mean, we've been talking about diversifying our trade for 40 years. And still, 75% of our goods go south of the border. We are overly dependent on one market. And that is a major weakness that we have known about for 40 or 50 years, and we have done very little to actually address it. And as Chris said, the U.S. is in very difficult circumstances. And when they sneeze, we catch the flu. And that's a deep, deep structural problem. So that challenges my autarky kind of framework, but should hopefully illustrate to us how maybe we're not globalized enough. We're not diversified. And yes, so that's an excellent point.
If I could just add to that, there are a couple of factors here. There's the pandemic that's forced countries to go into themselves, as Malcolm quite well spoke about. But there's the other factor of political leadership, not in Canada, but in the United States and in Britain and other parts of the world. There are leaders who are driving that defensive stance for putting up walls, putting up barriers. And right now we have President Trump, who is taking a leadership role, for good or bad, but a leadership role for pulling in rather than being international.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Our next question comes from possibly another student who was watching intensely our discussion, and here it is.
Do you want me to start, Malcolm? So it is, I would say, the difficulties that our students face, quite a lot of it is really heavily on international students. And the fact that ability to work off campus, ability to pay rent, to be stuck here for some of our students who can't get back to Belgium or Korea or Congo or wherever. So it's a multiple levels of difficulty. I would say that in part because of the lobbying by Universities Canada, the federal government has some programming support for international students to do some work off campus who are stuck here for the summer. But I would say that more has to be done by the provincial government. One of the things is the provincial government provides matching funding for scholarships and bursaries. If the university gives out $1,000, the provincial government matches that. That's usually every year. But the new criteria over the past 3 years by the provincial government is you have to be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident to qualify for that matching money that the university gives out to students. So that's exacerbated the problem. So I do think that there has to be a coordinated effort by our post-secondary schools in Manitoba to address this difficulty of international students, because it's not an easy one.
I think that's a very valid observation, and I'm afraid my answer probably isn't that comforting in the sense that we have quite weak supports for international students. They have to pay elevated fees and have restrictions on their work. The political scientist in me, the governments will favor the interests of the domestic students, particularly in a crisis, over that of the international. And it's for the simple reason that international students and their families can't vote and aren't here. And so in sort of the political calculus that provincial governments in particular are going to make regarding students, I'm afraid that the interests of the international students are not going to be considered, or not going to be considered to the extent that those of the domestic students are, and that is just problematically a product of our political system that will, and as the student points out, is being exacerbated by this crisis. So I'm afraid my answer isn't that positive.
No, thank you. Next question possibly comes from Bangladesh. Someone is asking the question about security and intelligence.
If I might, yes. I mean, again, we want to, you talk about the expanding capacities of the state to intrude into our lives, to control, monitor our behavior. This is going to be exacerbated by this pandemic. But now I'm not an epidemiologist, but my understanding is if we want to return to normal, one of the things we're going to have to do is have better tracking, including real-time tracking of people's behavior. And so we're going to have there's going to be a trade-off here between our freedom to wander around and do stuff and the electronic means that the state is going to have to take to regulate our behavior and to have information as to where we've been. Now, my understanding is that in some Asian countries, they have been very ardent about tracking people's movements and behaviors. I heard in some places when they enforce their quarantine rules, and they'll call you up and they'll say, take out your cell phone and take a picture of where you are so that they can verify that you're, actually in your house or wherever you're supposed to be. So yes, the intelligence agencies, the privacy matters around this are going to be very significant. But I think this is going to be part of the price we're going to have to pay to enjoy freedoms. Now the question is controlling that information, mitigating it. What groups are going to be? Are police agencies going to get access to it? Is it only going to be used for public health? But absolutely. But again, an expansion of the state and a further intrusion into individuals' daily lives.
Maybe
go ahead, Delanta.
I was just going to make a comment as an epidemiologist. So I think I agree a lot with Malcolm's statement just made. I think as an epidemiologist, I see a little bit more from a scientific standpoint. So as we know, the vector here is the humans. So if we can track humans, that means we are tracking the virus. There's no other way to track the virus. So we are tracking humans means we are tracking the virus. So if there's any system that can help in tracking the virus, like what we do for any disease, that it's humans or animals or in plants, that is what is done in epidemiology, tracking with spore traps, tracking with many different digital apparatus, PCR, all that is being done. And that is how you safeguard your country and your economy. So for example, if I talk about my own experience in plant science, if we have three major crops in Canada, canola, wheat, and barley. And we feed the world because of our small population, only 36 million people here. 70 to 85% of what we produce goes out of Canada. That's a huge export market. So if you look at it from an economic standpoint, it is great for Canada. But think about it. It is feeding the world. It is feeding the world in many different crops that we grow. So that will be completely devastated if we put down our guard and allow diseases to happen. So if a foreign material is brought to Canada, that can bring pathogens that are not they are going to survive easily because they don't have predators here, and that would quickly wipe out our crops. So we do tracking for that. And humans, when it is necessary, like what it is now, I think it is the right thing to do to track in whatever way possible, as long as, and again, this is where I agree with Malcolm's statement, as long as it is used only for that right purpose, and that's not used in the long run for other things that were not meant to be. So I think most of the countries, again, as Malcolm said, in especially third world countries, they didn't have money to think about how to apply that after the disease comes. So they had to stop the disease coming. So that was their strategy. Stop the disease coming so that they don't have to look at closures and stuff like that. So whatever tracking systems that different countries use, I think is legitimate, mainly to safeguard humans. So like, for example, as I said earlier, when you are against and put your freedom first, you are putting thousands of others' freedom to be ignored. Because if you are sick and if you are carrying, even if you are asymptomatic and you're walking around with the disease, you're infecting many, and those livelihoods will suffer not only for a short period. If they lose lives, that whole family will be struggling for the rest of their lives. So I think people need to understand where things have to be, and in that perspective, not always think that my freedom is paramount. Yes, it is, but you have to look at the big picture and especially in a disease that is spreading so fast. So in epidemiology, we discuss diseases in different ways. There are diseases that spread like this, slowly increase. Then there are diseases that increase moderately. And then there are diseases that increase like exponentially, like that. And this disease, unfortunately, is a disease that is increasing exponentially. So again, I think as an epidemiologist, a lot has to be understood about this disease. We are still at the very early stages of understanding it from an epidemiological standpoint. We are just going on anecdotal evidence right now. I think there has to be a scientific basis to understand this and study. I don't think even the information that's coming out of the United States by Dr. Fauci, those are the right information at this point, not scientifically sound, because initially he said no need of a mask, then later he said you need a mask. So so you have to go with what the science tells you. And if the science tells you that you need that initial break of the disease from entering a country or a local area, that is what you have to do. So I think there's a lot that we have to do to this disease. Unfortunately, a little bit of that infringement we'll have to tolerate.
I just want to add that, the response to the crisis, difficult measures are put in and pretty well accepted, Michigan notwithstanding. But we do accept that extreme measures have to be done. Like after 9/11. After 9/11, things were done in the United States. But the thing is that it's hard to move backwards, and so you take 2 steps in its direction because of a crisis that everybody recognizes, and you step back 1. And you don't step back to the original point. And I'm thinking in terms of data privacy, for instance. Over the past 15, 20 years, we've given up a lot on data privacy, sometimes for warranted reasons, but we aren't back. We're never going to get back to where we were 20 years ago. So I recognize that we address a crisis in terms of health security, but we will retreat a bit when it's reasonable, but I don't think we'll ever go back to the original point.
Maybe can I add a small comment to Chris's? I agree, Chris. I think one thing that we also need to recognize and realize is that what we see on TV and what the media likes to show is not exactly the view of the majority. When there is a protest, we see it at the legislative building in Michigan. I came from Michigan. Lansing was my city where I was my postdoc. So I know the city pretty well. And I know the people fairly well. They are not the same that we see on TV. And so unfortunately, we try to focus, and that's how the media likes to make a story out of things. And we see that. But I think the majority Americans are doing it right. They understand what is important to be done. Now in Canada, we are a little bit better, and that's part of the reason that we listen to governments, and we listen to and we recognize that the freedom has to have a cost when you think about the bigger picture. And I think that's where Canada has done a better job than the United States.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the next very interesting question. I think I'll flash it on the screen. It has come as a comment, but I would like to add another question from another participant in a different way. So here is the question posed. And before you start commenting, I would like to add, as I said, another question, because these might be pertinent and you might want to respond together. So I mean, anyone can jump in, because I think we are looking into balance of power, European Union, and how a post-COVID world might look like. And it goes back to Malcolm's initial comment about nation state taking preeminence?
Yeah, if I can start, I mean, I as I said, I mean, I think the European project is dead. That's a bit of a state. Now, just to be fair to the European project, it has fulfilled its core purpose, which was, of course, to keep Germany and France from fighting. And it has fulfilled that purpose, and we all know the devastating effect that Germany and France fighting had in the last century. So its core purpose has been fulfilled. But no, I mean, Italy, and Greece and these other countries do feel abandoned. Now, the response by the other countries is, well, you guys, borrow too much money and spent too much money, and we're not going to bail you out. But that's that's kind of at the core of the cleavage. And we'll see how it turns out. If Italy does default, and its debt levels are very significant, that will really be the sign of the end of the EU as a integrated economic project, and obviously illustrating the limited political cleavages, and then international relations. That's not my area, but I think the realist model continues to be very, very significant, and of course at the heart of the realist model is that of the nation state. So I suspect that will continue on as a very dominant theme in the future.
May I add something?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Malcolm. May I add something? Just I think in all
go ahead.
In all of these questions, there is something implied. It's actually China and the United States of America. Most of the time we are missing up this relationship. Now people are getting a sense that China is overtaking, and probably it will be the second biggest power in the world, and probably United States will have trouble to get back to its previous power structure and domination hegemony. So this is the tension that is going on everywhere in the world, and probably we see this kind of tensions and inquiries and queries, curiosities built in this kind of questions. Can you just focus something on that? Is that okay? How do the world communities see this relationship, power relationship?
I would also add, it's a disrupting force, much like, climate change is a disrupting force. We don't know how things will unfold as this, how the economies are affected, how trade is affected, how tourism is affected, all these things, how they'll mix up together. So it's fairly hard to predict. What I'm interested in seeing is when finally we see a real vaccine created, is who gets the vaccine first. And I think that'll be an unpleasant scenario, but I think we'll see something happening there. On the first question brought up by our friend Chris Hunt regarding the political connection between different elements, I think that was what he was getting at, is the in the podcast 529 earlier this week was talking about how attitudes relating to the pandemic is starting to cross-cut into different parts in the American electorate, and I think we'll have to this issue and how leaders have handled it, and the economic repercussions will play differently with different voters in the United States, and I think here as well that it'll affect. So when we start seeing the cross-tabulations of different demographic groupings and their party preferences, I think we'll start seeing some shifting patterns going on there.
Mm-hmm. I will flush. The next question came from one of the Winnipeggers, and she's interested to understand how community resilience looks like during the pandemic.
Well, I suppose by community resilience, you're sort of referring to non-state, non-market actors. Well, I think, again, I guess I sort of go back to my sort of thesis statement, which is that this really tests the mettle of institutions, and particularly at the core of communities, of course, our families. which of course we've come to recognize how significant families are. But for many families, I think this is, again, testing their strength. And initial numbers show that, divorce and separation rates are rising as people realize and come to terms with, problems, within their families. More generally, as a community, I think this is going to be really hard on community-based organizations. I think of my own church, and just the real challenges we're going to face. We've got a great big building that we have to maintain. We're not able to get there. We can't gather. Our contributions are down. So I think this is really going to hurt a lot of community-based organizations. And now, on an informal basis, I've gotten to know many of my neighbors far better than I've ever gotten to know. I've seen my neighbors out and about. People are friendly, warm, chatting. And so sort of on a personal level, I think it's actually been good. People have gotten to know, you call the perhaps your single neighbor who lives alone and make sure she's okay. And people are helping you. So I think on an informal level, it's been good. But for community organizations, particularly those that are, like churches or many of these charities that are dependent on contributions, it's really going to be difficult, very, very hard for them to make it through this. So that's sort of my answer.
Dr. Chris, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
I echo what Malcolm is saying. You could see like the restaurant Hermanos has just said that they're closing up in the Exchange District, and it's closing down because the theater district isn't going to be operating for a long time. So these ripple effects, as I said earlier too, small businesses where they've built up, over like 10, 20 years, a little bit of room, and suddenly they can't pay their bills, they can't pay their landlords, etc., and get wiped out and won't open again. The owner might be able to find other work, but the 5 or 6 young people working in that shop won't be able to. So I think the resilience we've been lucky so far, or we've had some roots and some ground laid so that we can survive the past couple of months. But if this carries on for a long time, it is worrisome. With that being said, we got through the Great Depression, devastating economically and for farms, etc. But our community grew back. We survived 2008, the devastation of the markets. So I do think that we have resilience, and I think we'll show resilience in the coming year and a half.
Chris just made a really good point there. Now, I do worry that unlike the 1930s, we have declining social capital certainly in Canada contemporary. People are not, pre-COVID, the bowling alone thesis, I think, is very, very valid. And certainly I see that occurring. I just wanted to say this is going to be devastating for the arts. The ballet, the theater, all of the many arts communities. This is really going to be hard on them. Again, because they often have big physical buildings that they have to maintain. They can't get together. Contributions are down. This is really, it's going to be a huge problem. And I really feel for, the arts, just speaking very generally.
Thank you very much. For the sake of time, we will take the last question from the audience today. And this is kind of interesting from a number of perspectives because Canada is one of the lead nations in the world which supports refugees and resettlement of stateless people. So here is the question, and it is kind of directly addressed to Dr. Hilal and myself, but because we are researching on Rohingya crisis, but it is, I just wanted to tweak the question for the panelists because we just would like to know your comments about Canada's future responses to refugee rehabilitation and resettlement, if you like.
So, should I start, Kausar?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay. One of the things is, and our college, as you know, has been involved with the Rohingya crisis very concerned about it. We've also been concerned about Syrian refugees. We've sponsored 2 families in partnership with other community groups. It's not like hitting the ball out of the park activity, but I think Canadians get very shocked when they learn the news of the desperate circumstances of refugees. What I do worry about is this circling of the wagons. You know, we become more protectionist. As Malcolm was saying, we start putting up things on our borders for economic reasons or maybe sometimes social reasons. I do worry about Canadians saying, well, we got to take care of our own before we take care of others. So our sense of internationalism, I do worry about it being eroded. I don't think it's eroded yet, but I do worry about a certain erosion about our care for issues that are over in involving refugees and others.
Dr. Malcolm?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a real, I think Chris is right. And I think people will be much less empathetic now, mostly because they're concerned about their own families and their own province and their own country. I don't think it'll be sort of activist, but more sort of reactivist. But I think this does not bode well for our for international refugees and Canada's response to it, and it's for those reasons that Chris just outlined. People are just going to be thinking of themselves and their own fellow country people. That's my sort of cold realist answer.
So organizations like this institute, CRRIC, will become more important rather than less important going forward.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you. Go ahead.
I just need to add that we can't jump into any conclusion right at this moment. We have to be very vigilant because different countries are responding in very different ways about the refugee situation. Like Italy is responding very positively that probably we will have to take more refugees.
Sure.
So as nation state idea is becoming more important, and it will become more important gradually, they will have their own independent refugee strategies. But the thing is that we will have to wait because now we are really busy with coping up with the problem that is going all around. So all the countries are employing all of their resources and their strength to cope the problem. So probably after 3 or 4 months, we'll be getting better sense about how the refugee crisis will be dealt with. And a lot of discussions are going on all around. We are having an eye on all those developments and probably will be able to present something in coming months. Thank you.
Thank you Dr. Dilantha, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add one comment. I think this is a temporary measure that is on the part of Canada. Canada has always been there for refugees, and I don't think that mindset can change just overnight, just because of a COVID crisis. That will not happen. And both governments, whether it is conservative or liberal, and also the NDP, are in favor of the needs of the refugees. And privately, as Chris mentioned, there's many organizations, colleges that are helping refugees. So I don't think that mindset can easily be changed and a nationalist kind of sentiment can be built. I think this is very temporary and it will be lifted, and the more saner, peaceful times we will be able to make refugees very welcome back to Canada.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you very much. So we have kind of arrived in the last part of our today's webinar, but I would like to listen from both the panelists what I would like to term as their last words. And we all would like to be hopeful for the future because for over 2 months we have endured so much. So last words from both the panelists, to start with Dr. Chris, then followed by Dr. Malcolm.
Well, thanks. So I'll be brief. There's silver linings to this past 2 months where we find ways to communicate with each other, find ways by which, I meet with my 5 other siblings on Saturday mornings by Zoom. I think we're finding ways to communicate to get around things. Malcolm and I and Delantha have talked about some of the real vulnerabilities or some of the resilience side of our society. But I have to say that when I get back to my regular type of work, I'll have learned quite a bit from this situation. And I think I've developed a little bit more empathy for people who live in isolation. And so those are my just final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for those, Chris. I guess my final thoughts are just my views tend to be very Canada-centric and very developed world-centric as well. And I do think Canada will do okay here, and I'm a little embarrassed at my neglect of the effect this is going to have on developing nations like Bangladesh in Africa, and it's going to be in Latin America, and it's going to be really devastating. And I wish I had more positive things to say about the response of the developed nations to aid our brothers and sisters throughout the world who have less. And I'm afraid I'm quite skeptical as to how much we will do that. And like I said, I'm very Canadian and developed world focused, but this is really going to have a devastating effect. And I'm not sure that the rest of the world, as much as I'd like to see a united front, they may have a discourse that is united, but when it comes to allocating resources, scarce resources, I suspect that the developed world in Canada will think of their own first, and that's a loss for humanity in general. And we'll just have to hope and pray that those places that are poorer and have it more, face difficult circumstances can get through, and that the developed world does more. But I'm very concerned it will not.
Thank you so much. So we end our webinar today with a happy note and hopeful note. And we thank the panelists and both the observers, Dr. Dr Mohideen from Bangladesh, Dr. Delantha from Winnipeg, to join in and interacting live. Thank you for your time and energy and passion. And I can assure you we have learned a lot, and we have seen different insights out of the crisis, and hopefully we'll together cross this crisis and come out as resilient as ever. Thank you once again. Have rest of the day nice and pleasant. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.